Hi everybody, this is a review of test 2, the integrated at-home test. It was my first time to try this and it was very helpful, helped me delineate the areas in which you all are not feeling secure. I would say in general that most of you did very well on clarifying an example of the different functions, but I found difficulties in certain questions or slight problems in your understanding of the concept, and I wanted to go through those very carefully. Most of the time, the question number 1, which was basically giving an example of the behavior, went pretty well. Sometimes you all did not stick with the actual example and strayed somewhat in terms of, adding information that would suggest to me that you needed to have an assessment procedure to rule out different problems. So, for instance, if you took DA 1.1, the immediate sensory stimuli, and you started talking about that this child was having doing self-stimulating behavior in order to avoid work or to avoid a situation, then you're not describing an immediate sensory stimuli, you're describing an escape behavior. And so even if you did that, if you had gone down into your establishing operations and your functional treatment plan and were able to show me that you had ruled out that it was related to work, that's what the teachers thought, but it turned out that it was actually self-stimulation, then that was fine, you would get credit for it. But if you didn't include that in your plan for the 1.1, then you might have lost credit for it. So just explaining that. So this first slide has to do with question 5, which was the question was, what is the establishing operation for the function and the maintaining contingency which keeps the behavior going? And many people had trouble with this, or they'd get it right for some functions and not for others. So I just wanted to keep it real basic with you and help you understand that an establishing operation for access behaviors is deprivation. Whether it's a perceived deprivation or an actual feeling of deprivation, that's what's most important. So if it's a sensory or an item or an event that they feel deprived in, then that's the feeling that they have, or that's the experience that they have that makes them want to get that. If you are full, then you're not going to want food. If you feel as though, if you feel relaxed and you don't feel the need to be moving around and seeking stimulation, then you're not going to do that. So deprivation is of what? You have to describe what is the feeling of deprivation. So in 1.1, if it's a sensory stimuli, then the establishing operation is the child feels the need to move around, the child feels the need to hit their head because it makes them, it helps them relax, or it helps them relieve pain in other parts of their body. If you think about current behaviors such as what we call cutting, or self-harm that has to do with the kids scratching on themselves or actually putting cut marks on themselves. That's a self-stimulating behavior in many ways if they're seeking pain. Now, if they're trying to escape pain, then the reason it's the same behavior, but that may be that may be a different function, right? It's going to be the immediate sensory escape. And so you wanted to be sure that you understand the difference. Now, the establishing operation for escape behavior is not deprivation. It's the presentation of something aversive. So in other words, with the establishing operation, you have a lack of something, and the establishing operation for an escape behavior is either over something, something that you have too much of, something that's uncomfortable, something's presented that the child doesn't like. It could be a person, place, or thing. It could be a sensory, whatever, but it's the presence of that is the establishing operation. The thing that they want to escape has now been provided, and so that's the important difference between those two, access and escape behavior. Now, abolishing operations, I didn't even ask for that, but I want to be sure you understand that for an access function, the abolishing operation is basically you are full. You got everything you wanted, whether it was you feel like you have attained all the tangible items you need, or it feels that you received all the sensory that you need. So you are basically, you've accumulated whatever it is that you need and you no longer need it. So that's the abolishing operation. For escape behavior, it means that whatever if they were able to escape the aversive event, that is the abolishing operation. The action of getting away successfully from whatever it is, whether it was the long, lengthy task, whether it was the difficult task, they were able to get away, so that abolishes their need to continue the behavior. Now, maintaining contingency has to do with the ABC. What is it that maintains the behavior over time? It does not mean what starts it, correct? It means what maintains it. So if you have a child that's allowed to bang their head whenever they're frustrated, and basically they are left unchecked, people let them bang their head, then that's the maintaining contingency, is however the situation is, that they get to continue to run away or they get to continue to access, is your maintaining contingency. So it could be, the answer to that is they got what they want. that maintains it, all right? So I just want you to understand that number 5 has to do with related to the actual function and to whether it's an access or escape, and then you have to be able to identify it more clearly. So on your own PMPs, you need to understand what the establishing operation is. You need to understand your abolishing operation and the maintaining contingency. Going backwards to number 3, where it says, what is the ABC analysis of this behavior? Some of you all got it correct, but when they ask for the ABC, they're asking for the current behavior that has not been tampered with. There's been no intervention. So what are the antecedents? What are the behaviors? And then how has the environment actually handled the situation? Not what you're going to do to intervene. So be sure you understand that. If somebody asks you for the ABC contingency, it's not what you're going to do. It is what is actually happening that brought you into the scenario. Your baseline charts were a little weak also. They should have gone along with what your, based on your treatment options. But I want to go in a little bit into the methodology of how you were going to identify your function. So I'm kind of going backwards a little bit, but let's go on to the next slide. This slide relates to question number 2. Name which method and describe how you would use to identify the function of the behavior. After you name the method, describe how you would set up and implement your test for that function. This should also be included in your own final PMP. It was part of the PMPs 1 through 10. When you developed your plotting, you developed your charting, you should have also done one of these formats in terms of looking at your own behavior. Now, you may not have named it in your small PMPs, but you need to name it in your large one. So here are the choices that you have with any functional behavioral assessment. You have to determine which one of these is going to be most valuable. So behavioral interviewing is a must, correct? When I asked you questions in class of, what you think is the cause of these behaviors, that's basically behavioral interviewing. And there was a whole list of things in your functional behavioral assessment book that gave you examples of that interviewing. But if you also look at the very back of the book, in the appendix, he has some excellent questions that you are allowed, you can use for formatting how you approach a behavioral interview with any family. Trigger analysis is the next opportunity you had. This is helpful when you have a low frequency behavior and it's not easily observable and you only have an hour of time. So what you do is you basically contrive or you precipitate the event that you think may be causing the deprivation or whatever the people involved in the scenario might look like. So let's say you have a child that is eating all day, and then you go to the classroom and there's no opportunity. They're actually, sitting, doing work. There's no access to the bags that are available that this child's been sneaking food out of. Then you would, truthfully, what you do is create a scenario in which you are going to be able to see them taking what they want to take and what are they going to do with it after they're done with it. Or if you think that there's a certain person involved in a scenario, then you might want to have that person available and ask them to do what they normally do that gets this child into a state of panic or anger or acting out. And so that's a trigger analysis, is basically you're forcing the situation. All right. Now the scatter plot is when you have plenty of opportunity to observe their behavior, but there are so many antecedent conditions that you don't know when it's happening. So you need a plot that helps you decide what is the timing of these things. When does it happen? Under what scenarios does it happen? Is it happen one-on-one? Does it happen in a large group? And you need to check off if this acting out happened at 2:30 p.m. and it happens with this group of children and it happens in this classroom, but it does not happen in the library, it doesn't happen at homeroom, etc., etc. So you want to reveal, basically you're setting up a plotting of the different possibilities of patterns that could be contributing. You're looking at your antecedents. An analog assessment is very expensive and very labor intensive, but it is actually the most reliable for determining the functions of your behavior. So basically this is another contrived situation in which you set up assessment conditions and you set up different variables that you want to eliminate. And in Sinpani's book, he talks about, in his articles, he talks about some researchers that have had some significant abilities to set up a four-system contriving situation in which they can determine whether it's socially mediated, whether it's a sensory issue, a demand issue, and so hopefully you caught on to those. There's 3 situations in which you really should consider an analog assessment being worth it. If you have set up several behavioral programs and it just has not worked on a consistent basis, it means that the function has not been determined correctly. If you have a child that's at risk of losing a placement, whether it's with a family, whether it's a daycare or a school, that's worth the time and money to do this. And when there is actual large time, money, and trained people who can do the task, it's worth doing. Now the in situ hypothesis testing is very similar to the analog, only you're actually doing it in the setting in which it occurs. So the analog assessment is actually done in a clinical research-based type of setting, whereas the in situ hypothesis testing would take place in the school or in the home, wherever it is that the acting out is occurring. So you want to compare, in that case, the baseline of the child's behavior with how it's going to happen with the treatment. So that relates then down to number 6. So if you decided in number 2 that you were going to use the in situ hypothesis testing, and how you're going to do that was going out to the home, you're going to observe on 3 different situations, 3 different home visiting situations, and you're going to make, you're making a hypothesis that it's the mother's feeding, how she's feeding the child, that is related to the child's acting out. And so you're going to observe 3 different feeding situations, and you go out to one feeding situation and it doesn't happen at all. You have to change your hypothesis, okay? Or you have to ask the parent in a behavioral interview, was this a normal situation or not? So you put these 2 together. Well, number 6 asked you to draw a baseline chart. So in there, you should have drawn the chart, what were going to be the variables that you're looking at, whether it's, whether they're in, and what kind of foods may be presented and how those are being accepted, how long was it taking, who was involved with it. If you tried a situation where mom fed the child and that went okay, and then you had dad enter the room and he tried to feed the child and it was a disaster, then that should be on your chart. And you should have created a pretend chart for me, just like you're going to create a chart in your own PMP. So be sure in your PMP that in your functional behavioral assessment, you identified what method you used in order to create the baseline measure chart that should be included in your topic of activity. So on question number 7, I got some very interesting answers. This had to do with, if there was a wacky contingency on your example, what could it be? And some of you all had some very creative answers, but they weren't what I was looking for. A wacky contingency has to do with an ABC analysis that shows that there is some reinforcement that is going on that is actually pretty silly and not very helpful. That's one example. Or it's counterproductive to what the person was wanting to reinforce. And so if you look at your textbook on 118 and 119, he gives an example of a wacky contingency in which a child who's worked really hard on their schoolwork turns in their schoolwork early, okay, before the rest of the class, and instead of letting them relax as a reward, the teacher gives this child even more work to do. And so then what's the incentive of working hard and doing it fast if you're only going to be loaded on with more work? So that's a wacky contingency, or what we call, I think it's a misguided contingency. So I want to go through the 3 types of problems that you may encounter that you should try to rule out before you even go into a lot of assessment of the problem with the child. If you can find one of these wacky contingencies, then there's no reason to waste time and effort on a problem behavior when simply counseling someone about how they can intervene in a different way, it would be very helpful to you. So I want to go through what they pointed out in the reading called Analog Assessment of Replacement Behavior. This was for your class 8, and so if you have not read that article, please go back and do it now so that you'll be prepared for your own PMP. So diagnosing the strength of a replacement behavior is a part of this whole function-based system. You have to understand in your own mind what is normal, typical behavior. When that happens, how come it is not being reinforced at the same rate as the behaviors that are problematic? So a wacky contingency is an example of that, where you have a child, when they're doing well, they've asked nicely, they've performed well, and nobody pays attention to them. Nobody is reinforcing the fact that they did the right thing. They are only reinforcing when something goes wrong. And so when we talk about that, we're talking about the strength of our reinforcers, and we need to assess how many times a child is getting reinforced for good behavior versus how many times they're getting reinforced for bad behavior. So if you're going to give them an alternate replacement behavior and you're not getting a high rate of performance, it means something is wrong about the reinforcer, that the teachers are not following through, or the reinforcement that's being offered is not at a higher level than what they were getting before. So, for example, let's use seeking behavior such as drug and alcohol seeking behavior. If you're asking someone to stop, drinking and stop using a drug, and you're asking them to replace it with another behavior, what is going to be the reinforcing effect of that other replacement behavior? It's going to have to be at least equal to, if not better than, what they were feeling before with the use of a drug. So that's a high competition thing. Being sober doesn't feel good to people, but being sober and making new friendships, having even maybe having the physical symptoms of withdrawal released through medication or whatever, that might be enough to at least equal what they were getting when they were using alcohol or drugs or what have you. So if you're going to identify the function, and now you're going to identify a replacement behavior, then your reinforcer has to be at a high rate in order for the replacement behavior to have the same strength. Okay, so you want to look at why it's not working in the environment and what's keeping that from happening. So one of the three possibilities you can have with a problem behavior is a misdirected contingency, and this is when the reinforcement rate for the positive targeted behavior is too low. The replacement behavior is not getting reinforced in the way that you want. So this is an example where a child asks nicely for a cookie, they don't receive the cookie. They ask nicely again, they don't get the cookie. They ask nicely again, and then it starts to become nagging. Now they're whining. Now we're throwing a temper tantrum and we're laying on the floor. And it's finally when the screaming happens that mom or dad or grandma gets the cookie and gives it to the child. And so the rate of reinforcement for the targeted behavior, which is to ask nicely, is not being reinforced at all. But what's being reinforced is this negative acting out behavior. And so, how are you going to reverse that is what is involved with a misdirected contingency. So the point in this is that if you have a misdirected contingency, there's no need to waste a whole bunch of resources on this kind of situation. You just need to remind people, remind the parents, remind the teachers that they're not reinforcing the targeted behavior that they want, that they're going to have to disable, they're going to have to learn to stop reinforcing the negative behavior and just simply reinforce the things that are polite and nice and hands in the air, asking, may I go to the restroom instead of screaming and yelling and all that. So there is going to have to be almost like a chain interruption. You're going to have to redirect that old behavior that's gotten accidentally reinforced. So in this case, with a misdirected contingency, you don't have to teach the replacement behavior. It was already there. You saw it happen. It just didn't get reinforced. There was no reason why that child should continue the targeted behavior, because nothing happens when you do the right thing. And so let me give you a kind of a teenage example of this that I've seen over and over again, in which a parent will give a child a gift, and then they will continue to use basically, removal or punishment methods instead of reinforcement methods. So when the child is doing well, nothing really happens. They didn't even get the gift as a result of doing something well. It was just freely given, whether it may be birthday or Christmas or what have you. So they get this really nice gift, and then when they misbehave, that gift gets taken away from them. but when they have worked really hard on a project, got a good grade, basically the comment to the child or the impression to the child is that's what's, that's what's expected. You're wanting to be reinforced for what is expected. And that's okay not to reinforce that, but if you're only reinforcing that you're going to get attention and you're going to lose things for bad behavior, then there's really no reason why you should be good. And so I've seen teenagers basically refuse gifts because they know that gift is going to be used as a manipulation tool to get them to do what they're already doing, but they're in terms of the good stuff. And so anyway, just an example where with a misdirected contingency, you do not have to go through a whole lot of effort in shaping or modeling or any of those other methods of developing a replacement behavior because it's there. The child knows how to say please, thank you. They do know how to do their homework. They do their homework. They're just not getting any recognition or notice of that. Our second example of a wacky contingency is what we call inept repertoire. And this is when the replacement behavior that everybody has decided is what they want as the targeted behavior is non-existent. The child does not know how to do it, or it's so infrequent that when you're trying to get the child to do it, they don't even really know what you're asking for, or their fluency of their ability to respond is not adequate to produce reinforcement. So an example of this is if you've decided to set a replacement behavior as an access mand, and you have a child that is has a really serious social anxiety problem, and so when it's an escape issue, and so when they're wanting to escape large groups, you've asked them to use access mand as a way to get their attention from the teacher, and yet they're too afraid to use their words in front of a large number of people. So they've never talked in front of more than one person at a time, or you might have a child who has a speech impediment and you're asking them to do an access mand, or you're asking them to give you hand signals and nobody in the class is even noticing them, or you telling them to use their signs and they don't even know the sign. So an inept repertoire is when we set up a reinforcement or we set up a replacement behavior that we haven't even assessed whether the child can do it or not, because nobody has ever seen the child do it. Nobody knows, and nobody makes that assessment. They don't take a look at the child's ability to do it before they put it into place. And so the functional reinforcement contingencies that are available for the behavior just don't happen because the child can't perform the behavior. So basically, if you have inept repertoire, the child doesn't know how to do it, then no matter how much you reinforce and try to create these situations where the child would be enticed to do the behavior, they don't know what to do, and so they never get reinforced, or they can't be reinforced in the way that you have set up the plan. So in this case, inept repertoire requires shaping. So this is where the alternative behavior are the beginnings of the replacement behavior you're looking for. So if you are trying to do access mand, you're going to have to shape, help them learn at least how to utter the sounds that you need them to begin uttering for people to know that they need something. And so many of the functional assessments require you to assess whether the child can do what you're asking them to do, and if you have assessed that they really do not have it in their repertoire of behaviors, then you have to build in a shaping contingency into your behavior. So let's say on your own personal PMP that you told me that you want to learn how to do cartwheels, And so you've never done a cartwheel in your life, and you've decided that for every cartwheel that you do, you're going to get to go on a shopping trip and spend $100. Well, it doesn't matter. If you can't do a cartwheel, you are not going to get to go shopping. It's a self-defeating situation. But if you decided that if you followed a shaping behavior and you learned how to do a cartwheel by the process of putting your hands on the ground, trying to lift your legs and set them down, and you had maybe smaller types of reinforcement before you got to a full cartwheel, then that's how that's going to work. So you have to build into your own PMP, or if you're working for a company, you need to build that in the shape. The third type of wacky contingency is faulty discrimination, and this is when the replacement behavior that you've picked only seems to happen, or the target, not the targeted behavior, but the behavior that you prefer, let's put it that way, only happens under certain type of conditions, certain type of antecedent context. And so it doesn't seem to happen in other places on a natural basis. And maybe it's because the child can't understand where they're supposed to do something. So for instance, let's say you have a home in which everyone in the home talks really loudly. They just are very demonstrative and have loud voices and don't modulate their voices. And now we have a child that at school is getting into trouble because they're so loud and disruptive in class. And so the replacement behavior you want is for the child to lower their voice and maybe not to speak for such long periods of time or what have you. All right, so nobody has assessed the home to determine that it's not that the child is meaning to cause problems or whatever, but they don't know how to take their behavior from one place and use it in another place because they've grown up in a situation where everybody uses loud voices, and maybe even under all contexts. Maybe they have parents that are very loud when they go shopping. They're loud even at church, and everybody turns and looks at them, or they're loud when they're in just one-on-one conversations with people, because there are folks even from a speech assessment that can't determine the volume of their speech. And so anyway, so if this is the case in which a child can't tell under what conditions that they're supposed to use the replacement behavior that you're trying to reinforce, okay? So the simple answer to treatment of faulty discrimination diagnosis is generalization strategies, helping them either learn how to take the replacement behavior in one area and move it into multiple areas so that they have success. Or the opposite is true, like in the case in which I was telling you about the child who lived with a family who's very loud no matter where they go. Well, you're going to be teaching that child, basically it's a form of shaping on how to go from this loud household into how to handle quiet settings, whether it's at school or a library or what have you. And so those are the three types of things that you can pick that are wacky contingencies. Hopefully that clarified. Then the last thing about the test I wanted to remind you of was on question number 8. It says, what are the function-derived treatment options for your function, and which are you going to choose? And then on question number 9, they ask if that intervention has any other terminology that is typically related to it. And number 10 is being able to detail and implement what you've said. Well, I saw a lot of weakness in number 8. This comes off of your PowerPoint 5A and B, chapters 3 and 4, where it takes the function and it names the intervention. So if you take 5A and B and PowerPoint 15, you should not use any other terminology for the answer on the intervention other than what Sinpani uses. And so I broke those down for you where you look at, if you look at function 1.1, there is only 4 options, and then you add to it the chain interruption strategy. Okay, so I'm just wanting you to be sure that you're using your textbook and you're using your PowerPoint. Then for question number 8, you can look at PowerPoint 14, which is an example of terminology that's used by other ABA specialists. And so when we talk about DRL, DRO, DNRO-E, those are the alternative terms that can be used for Sinpani's terminology. And then number 10 is you're supposed to break that down, but when you do this on your own PMP, every time repeat the terminology before you describe the detail of what it is, because I've had people say that on their test they might have said that they're going to use, for instance, an access manned, and they never even mention in number 10 what is it that you're asking them to ask. Instead, you're describing some other behavior that looks more to me like an alternate direct access form. And so I made a note of that. And my point being in this that PowerPoint 15 outlines the Sinpani method, and then I tried to take one of his other articles that helps. It is called The Differential Reinforcement Procedures for Access and Escape Functions, is also his writing, and that's on class number 8. And that's what I delineated for you in PowerPoint 14. So I hope all of that's helpful. Please do your best to keep up with your readings, because you'll still need those for test number 3. Haven't decided yet if I'm actually going to give you a take-home test on the 28th of November and let you bring it in on the last day of class. Haven't decided that or not, so we'll see as we go along. And be looking for our other PowerPoints coming up.